Okay, we are live to tape. Good morning once again, everybody, and welcome to week 6 and to section 2 of this course. You have all more or less, I hope, survived and thrived during the first part of the course where we looked at epistemology, ontology, philosophy of mind, a little bit about AI, philosophy of computing, and ended with perhaps the ominous thought that people and societies might be programmed as easily as computers are. I hope some of you are properly horrified by that idea. And in our case, as humans, we can always do something about it. Computers are mostly powerless to change what they've been programmed to do, but humans, hopefully, by being aware of the programming, can change the program. So I wanted to leave you with that happy thought. And now we embark on another very large topic, which has been intrinsic to philosophy since philosophy's inception, namely a topic we call ethics. It's a large and very interesting topic, and I'm sure I need not convince you of its relevance to daily life, as we all on a daily basis make decisions about what's good and bad, about what's right and wrong, about what's just and unjust. And so since we all devote part of our human existence to these ethical questions, it's certainly important for us to examine a little bit more closely the roots of the most important theories that influence us today. And that's what we're going to do in the next 5 weeks. We're only going to touch briefly on some of the more important and influential classical philosophies of ethics in the, again, the Western secular tradition. There are, of course, religious ethics as well. I won't be touching on them very much, but mostly we're looking at secular ethics. And before we dive into Aristotle this morning, who's our first up on the list, I just want to share with you a very brief overview about the nature of ethics in general and the kinds of approach that we're going to take. So please have a look at the slides I'm going to put up, if I can find them. Here they are. I have an ethics overview to share with you, and this will give you kind of a big picture. Of course, ethics is so important that we teach an entire elective, and one of the upper electives in our department is called ethics, and it's such an important subject that we teach it as a standalone course. And indeed, we could spend a whole course practically on any one of the ethicists we're going to look at in the coming weeks, be it Plato or Aristotle or Hobbes or Nietzsche. We won't look at Nietzsche, but certainly one can teach a course on him, etc. So if any of you go on to being philosophy majors, which I hope some of you will, or indeed philosophy minors, which is a little bit easier to acquire on your transcript, whatever your major may be, then the study of ethics is going to be required. So this treatment in our class is an introductory treatment, but please be mindful that there's a library full of books written by many important philosophers on ethics right up to the present day. And I hope that you find something interesting in this section of the course. And I'm quite sure you will. Students always do. I'm also quite sure it's going to provoke some very interesting discussion once we get to the sort of meat and potatoes of the substance, which we will do today. So this is just a bit of an overview. And let me share with you a screen dealing with a general overview of ethics for the purposes of our course, at least. Okay, so what happened to it? Seems to be gone. There it is. Can everybody, do you see this slide? Somebody has to, yes, it says main ethical systems. You're able to see that?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So I want you also to be aware that we can speak about ethical systems according either to a particular philosopher or according to a particular tradition of ethics. And each one has different strengths and different weaknesses. I want to claim this morning, and I think this will be backed up as we continue each week through a different key philosopher. I think you'll see that every ethical system that's ever been proposed has both strengths and weaknesses. If there were a perfect system of ethics, such that it appealed to every human being on the planet, that would be perfect, then probably we'd all be following it. But since it appears that we have major differences as humans even within families or with our neighbors or with our communities or with our nations or with other nations. We always seem to find ethical differences, and those differences often become the source of conflict. It's not just politics that causes conflicts, it's some of the ethical questions embedded in different political views that brings people into conflict. So you should be aware of that. And every system has, as I say, strengths and weaknesses, and we'll be making it clear as we progress what some of these strengths and weaknesses might be in each of the systems we consider. The one we start with a little bit later today is called virtue ethics. And this is a very large system. It's not only Greek, although we're going to look at the Greek exponents, Aristotle. Plato was also a virtue ethicist. That's Aristotle's teacher. We're starting with Aristotle because he's more clear, I think, and a lot easier for us to understand. Actually, Plato is quite deep and a bit mystical. And we'll cover him next week. But this week, we're going to start with Aristotle, his greatest student. And Aristotle is propounding something called virtue ethics. And in general, virtue ethics asserts that goodness is a byproduct of exercising virtues. In other words, if you want to be a good person, and you want to, or a good citizen, or a good family member, or a good whatever, then the way to do it, says Aristotle, is to practice virtues. And we'll talk about virtues in a little while. So we would say, if we were Aristotelians, that a good person is good because they practice virtue, because, in other words, they are virtuous. And many religions teach this as well on a religious basis. Aristotle is going to teach it on a secular basis. And of course, the flip side is badness. And Aristotle would also say, and does say, that badness is a result of practicing or exercising vices. So vice and virtue are opposites, but as we'll see, Aristotle made a really unique contribution to ethics because in his system, vices are not polar opposites of virtues. Virtues will always lie. A virtue for Aristotle is going to be identifiable because it's going to lie midway between two different kinds of vices. Vice of excess, which is too much of something, or a vice of deficiency, which is not enough of something. So virtue can always be found in the middle. And it may interest some of you that that notion, although it originated in the West with Aristotle, was also, prior to Aristotle, conceived by Siddhartha Gautama in India, in what is often described as the middle way. And Buddhism, some of you may know, or some of you may be Buddhists, Buddhism is very much devoted to the middle way, which is also a kind of virtue ethics. And additionally, in Confucian philosophy, which is indigenous to China and has a tremendous influence in Confucian cultures like Korea and Japan, particularly Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong. These are Confucian cultures. And Confucius also was a virtue ethicist. Although the virtues of Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius sometimes are similar and sometimes are different, nonetheless, they all preached and practiced the kind of virtue ethics. We're also going to look a little bit later at something called Deontological Ethics. That's a family of systems, and it comes from the Greek word deon, meaning duty. So if you're any kind of a deontological ethicist, you will assert that the rightness or wrongness of actions is not a function of the goodness or badness of their outcomes. Kant is a famous exponent of this, one of the most famous deontologists, and we'll be looking at Kant's theory a little bit later. So in other words, if you're a deontological ethicist or a deontologist, you will claim that the rightness or wrongness of actions is not a function of the goodness or badness of their outcomes, and therefore it must be a function of the inherent, in some sense, or logical rightness or wrongness of the actions themselves and not of what they bring about. By contrast, teleological ethics, again, a Greek word is the root of it, telos, meaning goal. Aristotle is partly teleological because there is a goal, a purpose, if you like, in his ethics, which is to become happy, as we'll see. In any case, teleologists assert that the rightness or wrongness of actions is a function of the goodness or badness of their outcomes. So that's exactly the opposite of deontologists. And please note, those of you for whom English is not a first language, For those of you who are English speakers who haven't seen the word teleological, it's not theological. I'm not talking about theology, right, which is the theory of religion, and theological ethics or religious ethics. I'm talking about teleological ethics. Again, asserting that the rightness or wrongness of actions is a function of the goodness or badness of their outcomes. And we'll look at a very famous exponent of utilitarianism, which is one such teleological theory, and that is John Stuart Mill, a little later in this section. So in other words, a teleologist will say, well, if you got a good outcome, you did the right thing. And if you got a bad outcome, you did the wrong thing. Whereas a deontologist is going to say that's got nothing to do with rightness or wrongness. If you have a good intention, then you're doing the right thing. And if you have a bad intention, you're doing the wrong thing, more or less, okay? So there's a big difference there. Platonic ethics is quite unique, and we'll look at him next week. And for Plato, goodness results from apprehending something called the pure form of the good. And we'll have a look at how he explains this and how we're meant to do it. Ethical egoism is a claim that maybe some of you are habitually nowadays taught to make. I am sure, because I've taught this course for many years and I've had experience of many contemporary students, I'm sure some of you have been brought up to think or taught to think or have concluded for yourselves independently that ethics are entirely subjective. So, you know, whatever you think is right for you. And whatever someone else thinks is right for them, and so forth, that there's no possible objectivity or even a shared notion of the meaning of what is good and right and just. But ethical egoism is further a claim that not only is that the case, but that everybody ought to pursue their own self-interest. In other words, everybody ought to do what they think is right and not take others into account. That's called ethical egoism for obvious reasons. And that's just a claim that everyone ought to do this or should do this. Psychological egoism is a more nuanced claim. And this is the claim that we're going to look at in Hobbes, the philosopher, and also tangentially, Freud made this claim. And that's why we all get into trouble in our relationships and you know, in our other kinds of conflicts in the human world. And psychological egoism claims that we are by nature ethical egoists. So in other words, nature has made us in such a way that each of us is sort of programmed instinctively to pursue our own self-interest. And if we don't find a solution to that problem, then we're going to be condemned to more or less perpetual conflict. So these are some views of ethics, different systems, if you like, or different views, ways of understanding ethics. What are we actually trying to do? Well, we're trying to answer three main questions. When we look at ethics, and I need to find my PDF so I can turn the page. Zoom is giving me a little trouble this morning, so bear with me, please. I'm going to stop the share and try and flip to the next page of the PDF. Well, I guess I was on the next page. I am the absent-minded philosopher this morning, and so you got page 2. Before page 1, so no harm done. I'm going to now share. I hope I haven't confused you so far, but that was page 2, and now I'm going to go back and share page 1 of the same handout. In any case, it's an overview. So please bear with me today. This is page 1, and this is what I wanted to start by saying, but it won't do any harm to conclude the overview with page 1. Ethics and aesthetics share a common root. Have any of you heard the word aesthetics before? I know you've all heard the word ethics, but there's a related word, which is also a separate subject in philosophy, and more particularly philosophy of art and of any art form. Somebody's in the chat room. Okay, so one of you has heard, some of you have heard the word aesthetics. Good. It's not necessary. It's something that shares a common root with ethics, and the common root is called axiology. They both branch from axiology, which is a theory of values. You won't find axiology in the college curriculum. There's no college curriculum I know of that has axiology as an actual subject, because its two branches are so interesting that they're each studied separately, namely ethics and aesthetics. You'll find those everywhere. but you won't get the common root in one course. I'm just telling you this for the sake of culture. So the common denominator of ethics and aesthetics is evaluation of this concept of goodness, which is a concept that comes up in every day in life, right? We value good deeds, for sure, and we also presumably deplore bad deeds, and we also value good arts. In other words, each one of you, I'm sure, enjoys a good book or a good movie or a good meal or whatever, we could apply a good concert, right? Is that fair to say that we use this word good, which notice commutes between the ethical and the aesthetic? So it's a very interesting concept. And the thing is, we value in both cases, whether we're talking about things that are ethically good or things that are aesthetically good, somehow goodness, if something is deemed to be good, it also means that we value it. But then this leads to a very central question for philosophers, namely, what is good? What is the meaning of this thing called good? What makes something good? When we say something is good, what are we really saying? Is it, again, a subjective opinion, or is it something more? And that question applies both to ethics and aesthetics. So the three main questions that ethics asks and that we're going to ask are as follows. What is good? What is right? And what is just? Okay. And Denise says, and you could say this to everyone, Denise, it's to me privately, I'll read it. It's a wonderful question. Is there a correlation that good is beautiful and bad is ugly? Sure. I mean, it kind of follows from art, certainly. If we talk about a good painting or a good sculpture, we often mean a beautiful one, don't we? And on the other hand, if we talk about something bad, then we do often associate it or correlate it with ugliness. And the same would apply to behavior. We could talk about a beautiful, well-behaved and badly behaved. And we could say that good behavior, we don't often describe good behavior as beautiful, but we do often describe bad behavior as ugly. We could talk about a riot turning ugly, right? Or what starts off as a peaceable assembly turning ugly, meaning it turns violent usually, or something like that. So definitely we associate those things, beauty with goodness and ugliness with badness. That's exactly right. And that gets reinforced. Denise goes on to point out, and I think you're absolutely right, that we reinforce this with imagery very strongly, whether it's literary imagery or in film. We will definitely want, that's what Hollywood does. And Hollywood has always done this, and Hollywood didn't invent this. They got it from novels. They got it from stories. They got it from fairy tales. If you read fairy tales, the princess is always beautiful, and the knight that rescues her, is always handsome, isn't it? And all stories are like this. They want to glorify beauty and defame ugliness and deformity. So there have also been important literary works that satirize this, or that criticize this notion, or that expose this notion in various ways. You can think of, just off the top of my head, the Hunchback of Notre Dame. You could think of stories that talk about this, and sometimes it's the other way around, where the frog is really a prince who's had an evil spell cast on it. And if the princess kisses the frog, then the frog turns back into a prince, right? So a lot of our literature and also our moral thinking definitely plays with these concepts, which associate good with beautiful and bad with ugly. That's right. And original fairy, depending on which country, Randy, certainly if you look at the Grimm, the brothers Grimm, Hansel and Gretel and those ilk of fairy tales, yes, exactly. The brothers Grimm, I mean, they have horrific endings. Perhaps they were meant to mimic reality. Nowadays, we want to tell a different story, don't we? We want to tell our children everybody lives happily ever after. So that's the more contemporary notion. Okay, meanwhile, the three main questions of ethics are what is good, what is right, and what is just. Presumably, if we know something about goodness, then we will also know something about distinguishing between which actions are right and which actions are wrong. That will be informed by our notion of goodness. And if we know something about goodness and rightness in turn, if most citizens are good in some sense, whatever that may mean, and act rightly, whatever that may mean, then if most people do this, we would probably say we have a just society. So these three are linked. you can't really talk about justice without talking about what is the meaning of goodness and rightness. So to have slogans like social justice may be fine, but if you do not explicate in a careful way what you mean at the core by goodness and rightness, then the slogan may be empty. No one will really understand what it means or what it might mean, even though people will mouth it. So we can't really talk intelligibly about justice without understanding something about these prior terms from which justice evolves or is derived, namely goodness and rightness. Okay? Important to consider that. And so most of the philosophers we're going to look at are going to attempt to tell us, to begin with, what might be good, and therefore what might be right, and therefore finally what might be just. It's a complicated derivation. It's not a simple matter. Finally, we can look at different branches of ethics. There are different ways of studying ethics. And at one level, if you're a social scientist, you could be a sociologist, or you could be a social psychologist, or a cultural anthropologist, and you might, or a political scientist for that matter, you might want to describe ethical systems in different places. And that's descriptive, right? That's why we call it descriptive. You're not making any value judgments as such about the ethical system. You're merely going in as an observer, as a describer, and that's what we call descriptive ethics. A little bit more involved is this notion of prescriptive or normative ethics. They're more or less synonymous, and they contrast with descriptive. Prescriptive, as the name suggests, prescribes a given system of ethics. And again, there are religious and secular systems alike. And if you're prescribing ethics, you're going to tell people what you think is right, what you think is good, what you think is just, yeah? And a synonym for prescriptive is normative. So every system in the world is that people practice is a prescriptive system, whether it's a religious system or whether it's a secular system. It's going to prescribe to you what is good, right, and just. And finally, for our purposes, comparative ethics evaluates, compares, and contrasts different prescriptive answers to these main questions. And this is going to be our focus. I'm not going to attempt to tell you what is good, right, and just. I'm going to attempt to read with you and discuss with you what different significant philosophers have given as answers to these three questions, and let you be the judge. Each of you presumably already has, I'm sure, your own notions of what is good, right, and just. Again, my job as a philosopher is to subvert your notions, to subvert your beliefs, to shake them up a little bit, to introduce some new and different insights, and then get you to rethink these questions. And maybe you'll come out the other end believing what you already believe, and that's fine. But if you do, you probably have better reasons for believing it, and you'll have more and deeper ways to defend your beliefs. Or you may change your mind as a result of what you're going to learn in the next 5 weeks. That's, once again, up to you. So we're going to do comparative ethics. We're going to look at different systems of prescriptive ethics and compare and contrast them. And that's our goal. There's a whole other branch of ethics called applied ethics. And maybe some of you have encountered it. Applied ethics applies, as the name suggests, various theories to the attempted resolution of moral problems and ethical quandaries that occur in the practice of professions. For example, and you can study in our department, engineering ethics, environmental ethics, medical ethics, business ethics. These topics are of paramount importance in everyday life, and they will be to you too, just in case you enter a profession. If any of you enter one of these professions, you're going to quickly discover that there are moral dilemmas, and that applied ethicists are the ones who are trained not to necessarily resolve them, but to help you formulate and address them in the most effective way. So every profession has a code of ethics. Some of you know this. Any profession that you enter has a code of ethics, with very few exceptions. If you don't mind me being a little humorous this morning, and maybe just a little bit cynical, I would say that the thinnest books of professional ethics are legal ethics. There are supposedly ethics that govern the practice of law, but in my experience, and I have no offense to any attorneys, they do tend to be very thin. And there's one, if you want to call it a profession, that appears to have no ethics whatsoever, and that's politics. So if you enter the political arena, I'm not sure I'd call it a profession, but it is something or other. And if you become a politician, I think that the main thing for you in life that's required for politicians to succeed, I don't care what party they belong to. I'm talking about this universally as a very cynical philosopher. You don't have to believe me or agree with me, but in my experience of politics, there are no ethics whatsoever. It's only a quest for power. And so if anything, it becomes really, in a sense, teleological. In other words, if you won the election, you did the right thing. If you grabbed power, you did the right thing. If you lost power, you did the wrong thing. That's how it seems to be judged. But you'll pardon my cynicism. Maybe it's more beautiful than that. Maybe I'm misrepresenting it. But if you go to the library, you won't find very many books on political ethics, I promise. Only Machiavelli. And of course, Machiavelli's famous advice to the prince. Maybe some of you have read Machiavelli already in a literature course. And if you have, you know that he wrote a very small book, impactful book, giving advice to his boss, the prince. And the advice was how to stay in power. And Machiavelli's conclusion is there are really two main ways to stay in power. You either get people to love you or you get people to fear you. And which of the two did Machiavelli recommend as being more effective? Does anybody know? Or you want to guess? Is it better to be loved or feared? According to, you knew this, right? Oh, look at this. So you all know Machiavelli. Okay, now I'm not going to say that this is political ethics, all right? I'm not going to go that far, and I'm in good company. The great 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell said that Machiavelli was not a book of political ethics. He called it a handbook for gangsters. Okay, that was Russell's little joke, a handbook for gangsters, because that's how gangsters rule. Is it not? Do people love gangsters or do they fear them? Usually they fear them. And that may well be a way to rule people, but one would argue, and many of our philosophers are going to argue in this course, that you cannot have a government by fear and call it a just government. That a government that rules by fear cannot possibly be just. And even though there are different versions of justice, I think that most of the philosophers we're going to look at are agreed that whatever justice is, it cannot be a system of fear. Okay, so relax. We're not going down Machiavelli's road, although it's a kind of interesting one, certainly psychologically and also politically. Where did you hear about this, Vanessa, Rachel? Where did you read Machiavelli? Was it in English or in some other subject? In political science? Good. High school history? Good. That's fine. You see, Machiavelli has, still to this day, a certain impact. Okay. Let's move on. And that takes care of those slides. Any questions about what we've just said? I have a couple of more pictures to share with you before we go to Aristotle directly. Any questions or comments about this overview? We've just clarified some terminology, basically, and introduced some fundamental concepts about ethics, right? That's the main task. So let me share a picture with you. Two pictures, actually. And some of you may know this picture as well, which will be fine. And it's a very famous picture in philosophy. If you go to philosophy departments, you'll often see this picture. And maybe some of you have already guessed what it is. So here's a picture. Has anyone seen this before? I'm sure some of you have. I hope some of you have. I'm looking at the chat room. Yes, Anisha has, Javier, Jeleni, many of you. You were there. Matthias, you were in Rome. You were in the Stanza della Signatura in the Vatican. Yes, isn't that wonderful? It's Vanessa, you're close. It's a fresco painted by Raphael finished around 1510. So we're talking, 5 centuries ago. But it's one of the most famous, if not the most famous, paintings of the Italian Renaissance. And it's a fresco, and it's in a public gallery in Rome. If you're ever in Rome, you can go to the Vatican. But there's usually a big line up there to see it, But you can't take a picture with flash because that will, of course, erode the color. But it's called the School of Athens. and that's a bit disingenuous because there were many schools in Athens. The title of the School of Athens is a diplomatic fudge because there were so many schools. Every philosopher had a school. So the original title of the painting is actually Knowledge of Causes. And what you see is a kind of model of a university. What you see are little discussion groups or little study groups. And each study group is being led by a philosopher, and they're discussing geometry and ethics and politics and whatever they took science to be at the day. Here's a guy at the bottom left, looks like he's on a laptop, right? Isn't that kind of spooky? It looks like he's looking at a laptop. You see that guy in the bottom left with the gray hair, with the people around him? And that's really a slate. There's obviously something written on a slate. And they're different study groups. And so they're looking at the different subjects in a curriculum that today you would find in a university. And that was the whole idea, to bring people together and to discuss important topics. So this was the representation of Greek philosophy, and it was Plato and Aristotle primarily who invented both the university and the curriculum that we're studying. This is the key thing. It's a historical reference back to Plato. And now I'm going to show you an enlargement of the central panel because, and not by coincidence, the first two philosophers at whom we're looking are exactly these two in the center of the painting, namely Plato and Aristotle. So just let me show you that, because I took the liberty of enlarging the central panel so you can see them more closely. And they're the two central figures. The older one on our left is Plato, with his finger pointing upward. And Raphael, interestingly enough, he put the face of Leonardo da Vinci onto Plato's body. We don't know what Plato looked like, but Raphael imagined him as Leonardo. And he's not giving Aristotle the finger. He's pointing upward toward the heavens because his theory of forms, his theory of goodness is disembodied, as we'll see. And he believes in something that is immaterial. And under his arm, he has a book called the Timeo, which is partly his theory of souls and his theory of forms. We're going to look at a different book of his called The Republic, in which he expounds this. To his right, to his left, rather, our right, is Aristotle, his most famous student, with whom he disagreed. And as you can see, Aristotle is pointing in a different direction, not in an opposite direction, but I see Raphael had studied philosophy and he really knew his Greek philosophers. So he has Aristotle with his arm pointing outward, not upward. And Aristotle's book under his arm is called Ethics. And he wrote two books on ethics, and the one we're going to look at is the one he's holding. It's called Nicomachean Ethics, named for his son Nicomachus. And Aristotle's pointing outward toward the earth. He's trying to tell Plato that we're embodied beings. And so the core of our ethics must in some way be related to our embodiment on earth and not to some abstract concepts in some other place. So that's why they disagreed. They're not opposite, but they're orthogonal. They're 90 degrees apart. So Aristotle had to found his own academy. He studied for many years with Plato, but was not named his successor because of these disagreements. So that's quite historically significant, philosophically important, and captured extremely well by Raphael in that painting. There's a lot of detail on this painting, and you could go online, and if you Google the School of Athens, there are codes, there's a map to everybody. They've tried to identify, art historians have identified almost everybody whom they think Raphael included. So there are dozens of characters in there, some of them famous philosophers, others less so. And if you're interested in a blow-by-blow, you can find maps online which purport to identify most of the people. In any case, we're looking at Aristotle this week because it's a little more straightforward, what he has to say, not less important, but I think easier to get a handle on, his virtue ethics. And then next week, we'll tackle Plato, his mentor, his teacher. And both of them have had influence on Western civilization, which is impossible to understate. The great American philosopher Alfred North Whitehead wrote at the beginning of the 20th century, he wrote, and I'm more or less quoting, he said that Western philosophy is 2,000 years of footnotes to Plato. So Plato's influence is absolutely astounding. And so is Aristotle's in a different way, but not in a less momentous way, these two. And that's why Raphael put them at the center of the painting. because both of their influences are huge right to this day. And also, they're the two ancient Greek philosophers at whom we're going to look in the first 2 weeks of this part of the course, okay? For that reason, both very important and still taught and discussed today. And there are plenty of Platonists out there who try to, I guess, practice Platonic ethics one way or another, and also plenty of Aristotelians. His virtue ethics has been adopted by many religions as well in the West. So a lot of people identify with this, particularly the Roman Catholic Church to begin with. And Plato inadvertently supplied Christianity with a metaphysical framework for some of its beliefs. So he didn't know that. Of course, Plato lived 3 centuries before Christianity, but even so, his philosophy turns out to be, in some respects, very, very applicable, as we'll see next week. But meanwhile, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. This is just a kind of an overview, which is not complete. And for what it's worth, we're going to dive right into Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Any questions or observations before we do that? And everybody's happy this morning? Okay. That's fine. So without further ado then, let's take a look at Aristotle and see what he has to say. So in this part of the course, what I've said to you earlier on when we began, back in, I guess, end of January, early February, remember, and please bear in mind, continue to bear in mind that it's important for you to do the readings as well as to attend the lectures or view them asynchronously, whatever is easier for you. But the lectures are only half of what's important in this course. The other half is that you spend an equal amount of time doing the actual readings themselves, because I can't go through the readings with you in excruciating detail. I can only touch on the high points and bring to your attention what I think are the most salient of those points, and certainly we can discuss them. But it's really important for you to put in the hours outside of our lectures time in order to digest the readings in greater detail. That will really deepen your appreciation and understanding of the material, and will also, of course, help you ultimately to write your essays. So please don't lose sight of that. The lectures are necessary, but not sufficient, okay? I thought I would just remind you. And that's going to be particularly true in this part of the course. And the more you can read outside of class time, the better off you're going to be in digesting these very different and sometimes conflicting views of ethics. So without further ado then, let's see if we can pull up Aristotle. And here he is, at least on my screen. Are you all able to see what I'm showing now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very much. Good. Okay. Great. Glad. So here's the textbook treatment, and you'll find him in your text. It's very easy to find. He's in the ethics section. Again, your page number may be different from mine, depending on the edition of the book you're using, but you will, I guarantee you, find Aristotle Nicomachean Ethics in the table of contents. Whichever edition you have, it's there. You can also find it online because it's PDF'd all over the place. And also, again, Nicomachean just refers to his son, Nicomachus. He dedicated it to his son, so that's the adjective. The ethics themselves are virtue ethics. As you can see, these are his dates. He lived in the 4th century BC, and without a doubt, one of the most important philosophers in the West, student of Plato, and in many important ways his views diverge from those of his teacher. This is all true. So you can have a look at that for yourself. And what Aristotle is advocating, in particular, his moral theory, his virtue ethics, are focused on one thing in particular, and that is human flourishing. And that is leading, the notion of a good life is a notion that isn't just one happy moment in life. It's a question of a kind of happiness that endures. The Greek word is eudaimonia, and it's translated various ways. We think happiness is more like a mood. You know, you can be happy one moment and sad the next. but eudaimonia, in the sense of flourishing, could also be translated as fulfillment. So it's more persistent. It's a feeling of accomplishment, which brings with it good feelings, happy feelings, flourishing feelings. And this is the concept that is captured by eudaimonia. We don't really have one word in English that is literally that, but this is the notion. And Aristotle argues in this book that by practicing virtues, we will indeed attain eudaimonia, or flourishness, or happy flourishing, and that this is the most valuable thing in life. More than money and power and honor and glory or whatever else you may be after, happiness is the most important thing. And he'll give you an interesting argument for that, which we're going to look at shortly. So he wants to talk about ends, that is, aims of things, and everything, he says, aims at some good or some result which we want to achieve. Yeah, so he gives some examples. Obviously, on page 1, you can see the ends of medical art is health, right? If you are a doctor or somebody in the medical profession, your idea is to restore someone's health, right? To cure disease and restore health. So the end of medical art, meaning the purpose of medical art, is health. The purpose of shipbuilding is what? Well, you end up with a ship, right? If you call yourself a shipbuilder, it means you have a purpose, which is to build ships, right? If you call yourself a strategist, then the purpose of strategy is victory, whether it's victory in a political process or victory in a war or on a battlefield or whatever. If you're studying strategy, or in business, how to succeed against your competitors. If you're a strategist, you seek victory. If you're an economist, then obviously you're prescribing some sort of theory which enables people to accrue wealth. So these are all purposes. Every study, so Aristotle is telling us that everything we study in life aims at some purpose or some goal. And bear that notion in mind, because it will recur. It's a very important notion. So let me find the page turn here. And you should read this on your own. But I'm going to just highlight a few things. And what do you think is the main aim for us as humans? Well, Aristotle says some people want wealth, some people want power, some people want knowledge. But Aristotle thinks in general that we really want, whatever our particular pursuit is in life, that the overarching goal is to do well and to be happy. More important than anything else is happiness. And he asks a really interesting question here. And that is that he repeats what he said earlier about all of our different pursuits having a particular goal, right? Obviously. But there's one overarching goal to everything. One final goal, he thinks, one end, or one final purpose to all of the efforts that we make in life. And he says as follows: we call that which is in itself worthy of pursuit more final than that which is worthy of pursuit for the sake of something else. And that which is never desirable for the sake of something else is more final than the things that are desirable both in themselves and for the sake of that other thing. So what is the final important goal in life, says Aristotle, is that thing without qualification that is always desirable in itself and never for the sake of something else. So in other words, we need to distinguish, and I'll enter in the chat room if I can, what Aristotle is trying to say here. And there's a distinction that you've probably thought of or heard of yourselves. It's instrumental. In other words, instrumental, let me just type that in, versus inherent value. Okay, so we generally pursue things in life that have value for us, whether they're material things or whether they're relationships or whether they're paychecks, whatever it is we're pursuing. We pursue things or, some meal you want to cook, but all these things have value for us. And some of them have instrumental value. And some of them have both instrumental versus inherent value. Instrumental value, if a thing has instrumental value, it means that it's good for some further purpose. Yes? So money, exactly, Vanessa, perfect example. Money is totally instrumental, since we always want money for some other reason and never for its own sake. Because money buys things, right? Why do you want money? Well, we need to eat, we need to pay the rent, we need to clothe ourselves, we need to take a vacation, we need to buy whatever it is we need to buy, or we need to help others who have less than ourselves, or whatever it is. That money seems always to serve some further purpose, right? Having money isn't going to sit forever in your pocket, probably. You're going to spend it. So that's because money is instrumental. And if you want the proof of that, this is not from Aristotle, it's from common sense. If you're imagine you were stranded on a desert island, okay? And you had a whole trunk full of money. Would it do you any good whatsoever? Absolutely not. And if you do that thought experiment, it's like if you were stranded on a desert island, what would you put in that trunk? Okay, suppose you could be stranded on a desert island with one big suitcase. What would you put in the suitcase? Water and food. Well, they also have instrumental value because they keep you alive, right? So they're also instrumental in a certain sense. Food is both, because you could enjoy a meal, right? A delicious meal. We're back to aesthetics. Isn't a delicious meal also inherently valuable? You enjoy the taste of food. So food could have inherent value in terms of the art of preparing tasty food. People appreciate the food, but food also has obvious instrumental value because it keeps us alive. In fact, water is more important. We know that we can go without food for several days or even weeks in an extreme and not die. But if you go without water for a few days, you probably will die. We get dehydrated, we're done. So water is, the most essential thing of all. But that's instrumental because it keeps us alive. The purpose of water is to keep us alive, right? The purpose of money is to help us buy things and so forth. A job may have both instrumental and inherent value. A job, if you enjoy your work, then it has definitely inherent value. But for most of us, a job is instrumental because it allows us to survive and pay our bills and thrive, right? So it's good you're thinking about these things. So now Aristotle is asking, is there anything that we choose only for the sake of its inherent value and for no other reason? And it seems to Aristotle, and he argues, that happiness is such a thing. Because if you want to be happy, says Aristotle, it's always for the sake of happiness and not for the sake of something else. It's like we never say, as soon as I get happiness, I'm going to use it for X, Y, or Z. That makes no sense. What do you use happiness for? I mean, it makes no sense to ask in a certain way because happiness is valuable in and of itself. If you're happy, you're done. I mean, there's nothing else you need to do but remain happy. Isn't it so? If you did the social science and asked people whether they'd rather be happy or unhappy, I'm sure most people would say they'd rather be happy. And as you know, that's written into the preamble of our own Declaration of Independence, the idea of life, liberty, and what? What was it? What were the words? Life, liberty, and? Anybody know? Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, exactly. Only in this case, the pursuit of happiness, very good. So, but pursuit of happiness, doesn't that imply that happiness is outside us? It's like if you're chasing happiness, then it's not inside, it's outside, you have to catch it. It's like big game, you have to hunt it down, right? Pursuit of happiness, you're chasing it. And Aristotle has something else to say. Aristotle is going to tell you that the key to happiness is inside, not outside. And that the key to happiness is actually the practice of virtue. So that comes from the inside. And that's a big premise or a big actual claim of virtue ethics, that virtues are not outside you, virtues are inside you. And that all you need to do is develop them or cultivate them, and then you'll become happy. And if you become happy, then there is nothing else in life that you really need or want to achieve. So that is the final end for Aristotle, this flourishing, this notion not just of a transient mood, but of a enduring state or sensation of flourishing, eudaimonia. And notice, he says that honor, pleasure, reason, and all these other things. Well, we choose for themselves, but we also choose them for the sake of happiness, don't we? We think, oh, if I get honor, if I win this award or whatever, it's going to make me happy, right? If I win an election, it's going to make me happy. If I win a prize, it's going to make me happy. So you may value the honor in itself, but it also, you hope, will bring you happiness. And people chase pleasure for the same reason, and people chase money for the same reason. People chase a lot of things for the same reason. In other words, they think it will make them happy. But notice that happiness alone has inherent value, and it's not to do with instrumentality. Okay, so that's a big point. And then we may well ask, well, how do we get there, right? And that's the purpose of this book. Aristotle is talking about how do we achieve and sustain that kind of happiness, independent of other things, right? I hope you know, or maybe you've in your own life experienced that money is instrumentally valuable, particularly in a country like the US, which is pretty materialistic society, but money alone doesn't necessarily guarantee happiness. Is that fair to say? Yes, okay. I mean, you don't have to agree, but I think from life, we meet a lot of people who have money, but are never satisfied, right? For example, there are a lot of wealthy people who are very unhappy. A lot of people without a lot of money who are very happy. So in other words, interestingly enough, money does not buy happiness. Yeah, more money, more problems. You got that right, especially in the US. It could certainly help. Shidobe, I'm not disagreeing with you, particularly in New York, expensive city. Money definitely helps, but it won't necessarily make you happy. If it did, people would make a certain amount of money and stop, but it seems like some people never stop. So obviously money is not buying them happiness. It also can't necessarily buy you health. Unfortunately, a lot of people with money for all the health care in the world still succumb to illness. And so, money may help at times, but not always. And in any case, it doesn't buy happiness, it doesn't buy love. And that, I think, is for sure. Okay? So happiness, on the other hand, we don't want for the sake of something else. That's the main point. Now, Aristotle is going to go on to explain that this kind of happiness is very important. That's why I've highlighted this passage. I'm assuming you're going to read all the rest in between on your own time. But this is very important. Happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with perfect virtue. This, in fact, is the formula, and we have to unpack it to understand what it means. But I need to explain to you that this Greek word soul is not the kind of religious word that we tend to associate with the word soul, let's say in the Abrahamic tradition, where the soul is like immortal, and goes on to the afterlife, that kind of notion of the meaning of soul. This is not the Greek meaning. This is not Aristotle's meaning. The Greeks were pagans. Remember, they were writing here 3 and more centuries before Jesus. And the Greeks were therefore talking about a secular soul, not a divine soul. So it's not a religious conception. The word soul is not religious in Greek philosophy. It's secular. And specifically, Plato and Aristotle have similar but different views of what the soul is. And for Aristotle, to start with, there are 3 parts to the soul. Right? There are 2 main parts, a rational and irrational part. So the rational part, you already understand, it's the mind, the powers of the mind, what Descartes, was talking about when he talks about reason, what the rationalists value, and that goes all the way back to Plato, who was a rationalist himself. So was Aristotle in that sense. But for Aristotle, the soul is partly rational and partly irrational. In other words, mind is not in total control. And the irrational parts are twofold. First, he talks about the sort of biological part of the soul, which is concerned with nutrition and growth. So it's a vegetative. Aristotle calls it the vegetative part of the soul. Today, we would really call it the autonomic nervous system, the thing that keeps our heart beating, the thing that helps us digest food and extract nutrients from it. All these things plants do. How do we make energy? How do we metabolize from what we take in from our environments and turn it into energy that we use to grow and to thrive? Though that's what Aristotle calls the vegetative aspect of the soul. And the animalistic aspect, Aristotle also believes there's a vegetative and there's a kind of instinctive aspect of the irrational. And the instinctive is all of our desires, because unlike plants, we move around, right? We chase after things, we see things, we want things, we get things. So that's what he calls the desirous part, or the instinctive part. But our instincts and our appetites are not controlled by reason. And I'm sure you've realized that. We all have that conflict, right? So for Aristotle and also for Plato, important to note that happiness is also going to be not just an activity of the soul, but it's going to emerge as a byproduct of a balanced soul. So the idea of virtue ethics is going to be, by exercising virtues, we balance our soul. And by balancing our soul, we end up with this kind of eudaimonic, persistent state of flourishing or happiness. And that is the key. So it's balance of the soul. Activity of the soul means we have to do something. We don't just think. For Plato, we think more than anything else. For Aristotle, we have to be engaged in activity, but we also have to channel that activity in accordance with virtue. And because we have to act as embodied beings, remember his arms pointing out in that painting, showing that we're embodied, we're part of the earth, we're made from the earth, and we need to act in order to live. But to be happy, we need to act in accordance with virtue. And so that leads to the question of what is virtue and how do we actually balance our souls by acting in accordance with it, okay? So I hope that unpacks the incredible importance of that sentence, which is really, in a nutshell, the kind of recipe for how to achieve fulfillment. So understand that much, and then obviously it's all going to hinge on what virtue means and what perfect virtue means for Aristotle, because that's going to define the activity of the soul. And the question is, Aristotle, happiness and content. You roughly, but not quite. Happiness is more. Contentment, again, is not strong enough, I think. Shidobe, it's really, happiness is fulfillment more than contentment. So of course, if you're fulfilled, you're content. If you're happy, you're content. But also it's the notion of enduring or perduring or persisting happiness. So it's not just euphoria, it's not just a passing mood, okay? So of course, people who attain eudaimonia are all of those things. They're happy, they're content, they're fulfilled. Fair enough? Is that okay? Yeah, you're welcome. All right, so now we come to the crux of the matter. And again, I'm skipping ahead, but you know, we haven't studied virtue. And surprisingly, less and less in our contemporary society are people at all concerned with virtue, or children at all taught anything about virtue. And that also, for me as a philosopher, observing what goes on in the world is one of the main reasons why there's so much unhappiness, because people have lost track of the importance of virtues. And I'll give you some examples. Maybe some examples will spring to mind too as we look at Aristotle's theory. So in book 2, so book 1 is the setup, and in book 2, he begins to describe what he means by virtue, and also more particularly gives us his very unique theory of what a virtue is, and therefore also how to practice it or them, okay? So first distinction is really key because he claims there are two kinds of virtues, intellectual and moral. And intellectual virtues, he says, he argues, owe both to birth and to teaching. So nature and nurture. In other words, some people go on to become world champion chess players. He would say that's an intellectual virtue. But probably not everybody can be a world champion chess player, because it depends on two things. It depends on something that you're born with, which is the real ability to do that, and also whether you're exposed to it, whether you have teachers, and whether you have an opportunity to develop those capacities. And the same would apply to any subject that you study in the university. It seems very clear that we all have different capacities. That's why we have so many different choices. Maybe some of you are finding it hard to choose a major. That wouldn't surprise me. There are so many things that you could possibly major in, and maybe you're able to do a lot of things well. So you have a certain intellectual endowment, but that's not enough. You have to study them, and you have to choose what you're going to study. This is not necessarily easy, but there's no question about it that we all have some capacity at birth to learn certain things, and not everybody can learn all the same things. We all have different tastes and preferences, and some of those also probably have their roots in some kind of hard wiring. We don't know, but there's some evidence to support that very strongly. And the most famous things are the twin experiments. Identical twins who have been separated at birth, who later meet each other in adulthood, and they end up wearing the same clothes, and they end up doing similar things in life, although they've been separated since birth. So it's a very strong argument in support of the idea that there's something in our nature which is sort of fixed. But then the other half of that is nurture, right? Nature and nurture are two supremely important forces that help to shape our path in life. So it's not just that we have the perhaps natural ability to do something or other, but we also have to study it and learn it. And so education becomes a vital pillar in the development of one's innate capacities. And that's why Aristotle, like his teacher Plato, placed tremendous emphasis on the importance of education. No question, it requires experience and time to cultivate whatever kind of capacity you are gifted with, whatever kind of excellence you are born with. And Aristotle thinks everyone is born with a particular kind of excellence, which they have to discover and then develop. And that's what he calls intellectual virtue. And it's up to each of us to find our paths in life. Some of you may know from an early age what you want to do, and some of you may have to experiment with different kinds of studies to find your way. But that's all called intellectual virtue by Aristotle. And as I say, and as he says, it's a question of nature and nurture, both of those things. But it's a very different story when we talk about moral virtue, and this is where his theory has tremendous traction. Moral virtue, Aristotle says, comes about as a result of habit. Okay, it has nothing to do with birth, and it has nothing to do directly with your experience in time as you decide to, cultivate them intellectually. It rather has to do with something else. We are all, Aristotle goes on to argue, creatures of habit. This is one of the origins of that notion, that as human beings, one of the things we do is form habits. I am certain that each and every one of you has a particular set of habits, which you very naturally have formed. All of us, me too, we all have habits. And moral habits are called virtues. Okay, so if we have the habit of practicing virtues, then we will in fact become happy. If we have the habit of practicing vices, we are going to become unhappy. So intellectual virtue, please make sure, Randy, that you distinguish very carefully that intellectual virtues owe to both nature and nurture. Whatever you achieve intellectually in life is partly what you're born to be able to do and partly what you are actually educated to be able to do. That's intellectual virtue. It has nothing to do with moral virtue, however. Your goodness as a person, Aristotle is saying, or your badness as a person, has nothing to do with your intellect and nothing to do with your education. And surely in your own experience of life, you will meet people who are good-hearted, people we would call good, who are very kind and generous and treat each other well and can be trusted and are good people. They don't need a lot of education to be good necessarily, do they? No, of course not. I mean, you can meet really good-hearted people everywhere in life, independent of where they went to school or what they studied. And to put it in the other sense around, just because someone has a lot of education doesn't necessarily mean they're a good person. Is it fair to say? It's not a lot of education alone that makes you a good person. Aristotle would say not at all. Not at all. Definitely. Okay. So maybe you can think of examples from your own life. And I can think of examples. I mean, I'll share with you my own family, were immigrants, a long time ago, but my grandparents didn't have much education. They didn't have a chance to, but they were really good people. I mean, really good citizens, because they had this kind of virtue. And so they were good in that Aristotelian sense. Whereas, just because we grow up with more opportunity, perhaps, and maybe have much better educations. That's not what makes us good. Okay, so I hope you take this to heart or think about it. It's a very, very powerful and very sensible doctrine that he's trying to impart. And so moral virtues, he says, and this is the key thing, moral virtues arise in us by nature. Okay, none of them do. None of them do. We're not born good or bad. We're born with the capacity to become good or bad. I'm just reading what he says. It is also plain that moral virtues do not arise in us by nature, for nothing exists by nature that can form a habit contrary to its nature. So, for example, the stone, which by nature moves downwards, they didn't have a good theory of gravity back then, but they knew that stuff fell down naturally, not upwards. He says you can't train a stone to fall up, right? That's very funny. You could try and train it, quote unquote, train a stone, throw it upward 10,000 times, the stone's never going to learn to fall upward because it's against its nature, right? Clear enough? So things that are governed by nature cannot easily or at all be changed because there are obviously natural laws that govern them, okay? Whereas virtue, moral virtue specifically, is not governed by nature. People can become good or bad depending on the habits they acquire. And that is the key. So Aristotle is actually very egalitarian in a certain way. He's saying that nobody is born good or bad. What we will do is acquire habits in life. And if we acquire good habits, we will become happy. And if we acquire bad habits, we will become unhappy. And of course, happy people will tend to treat each other better than unhappy people do. And particularly if we acquire bad habits, we'll do harm to ourselves and others, and we'll never be happy in the process. So that's the importance of moral virtue, which has nothing to do with nature at all. Okay? Neither by nature nor contrary to nature do virtues arise in us. That's a very important claim, and you need to understand it. That's really key, that moral virtues are independent of nature. And we're adapted, he says, by nature to receive them. In other words, nature makes us creatures of habit. Every human being is born to be a creature of habit. We all have habits. Everybody has habits. But the question is, are they good or bad habits? And virtues are the best possible habits for Aristotle. Okay, did you get this? It's very important. It's really an encapsulation of his whole theory in that paragraph. Of course, he's going to spell out what he means by virtue, and that's what you're going to study in your breakout groups, is a specific theory of what is virtuous and what is vicious. And I'll give you a quick overview before we finish class today, but I wanted you to understand this, that intellectual virtues owe to two things, to nature plus nurture. But moral virtues have nothing to do with nature, nor are they against nature. They are completely dependent on habit. What he doesn't say, and I cannot really forbear from adding, Confucius knew this, and Buddha knew this also. Aristotle probably knew it, but he didn't say it. Randy, habit would be on a spectrum of good and bad. That's right, exactly right. I mean, habits can be good, habits can be bad. All we know thus far is that we are born to be creatures of habit. So if we acquire virtues, it's not because of our nature and it's not against our nature. It's just our nature to acquire habits. What determines whether those habits are good or bad is another matter, isn't it? And what's going to determine whether those habits are good or bad is partly habit itself, but also partly what we're exposed to when we're young. And for Aristotle, that's much more important than nature. In terms of forming habits, we are mostly going to form early in life, we're going to form the habits that are kind of ingrained in us by the people who are in control of us, right? Our parents, our peers, our friends, our teachers. The first 7 or so years of life are those during which we're going to form the habits that will be hardest to break later. So if we're fortunate enough to be exposed to good habits when we're young, we'll have a strong foundation for practicing virtues as we continue in life. If we're unfortunate and we get exposed to bad habits early in life, it's going to be much harder to break them later. Okay? And let me play devil's advocate because I can't resist. What's easier to acquire in your experience? Good habits or bad habits? Everybody knows this. Everybody. An avalanche Yes, bad habits for some strange reason are easier to acquire than good habits. And and then the flip side is what's harder to break, good habits or bad habits? Is it harder to break a good habit or harder to break a bad? Once again, everybody knows the answer to this, yes. So it seems like the dice are loaded, right? If we're looking at virtue ethics, and we can say, okay, fair enough, okay, so moral virtue is independent of nature, and it depends on our environment and what habits we form. But if we look more closely at habit, we see that really we're not on a level playing field with good and bad, because for some reason, it's always easier to form bad habits and always more difficult to break them. It's easy to start smoking, right? Easy to start smoking cigarettes, very difficult to stop, right? Easy to overeat junk food, easy to eat too much sugar and fat and all the stuff we love, but it's bad for us, right? Very hard to stop. It's sort of very hard to drag yourself to the gym, even when you know the exercise is good for you and so forth. So there's something bizarre about the fabric of the human world, because even though we know better, we don't often do what's best for us. So, I mean, Aristotle is presenting this in a fairly neutral way, but obviously from this huge response, you all know perfectly well that good habits are not that easy to acquire. Bad habits are easier. So in other words, it's easier to be vicious than to be virtuous in Aristotle's vocabulary. Virtues are harder than vices, right? And vices are easier than virtues. So I just thought is it human? Well, remember, Denise, human nature, yes, maybe, but it's human nature to acquire habits, right? Aristotle, I'm saying to you, and you're agreeing with me, that there's this additional kind of caveat that we're just, okay, we're creatures of habit, but Aristotle is making it sound like it's just as easy to acquire good habits as bad ones. And we seem, at another level to think maybe that's not truly the case. Confucius knew this. He said, he observed the same thing. Confucius said, it's a strange thing, but everything that's good is hard to achieve, and everything that's bad comes really easily. So I don't know if that's human nature, Denise, or if that's the world, or if it's a combination of both. But it seems like the playing field morally is not entirely level. So there's always this tendency to slide toward the vice and to have to struggle to get back to the virtue. Instant gratification. Well, there you go. That's a very good specific point, that insofar as we're not able to defer gratification, we're much more likely to end up acquiring vices than virtues, because sometimes virtues will require that we postpone gratification. Perfect example being your studies. Those of you who graduate, when you do, you're going to be elated, you're going to be thrilled, and your degree is something that will be a virtue for your life. You'll always have that degree. No one can take it from you. It's kind of a plank in the ship of your fulfillment as you sail through life. But you have to be able to defer gratification. Commencement happens once, but you got to put in 4 years of very hard work, usually, to graduate. So gratification in academic life is certainly not instant, just the opposite of instant. So being able to defer gratification is also a kind of habit that we need to develop. Those who have trouble deferring gratification and who need immediate and instant gratification are going to get into all kinds of trouble. We expect babies not to be able to defer gratification. Like when a baby needs something, it cries, right? If a baby needs food, it cries. If a baby needs to be changed, it cries. If a baby needs attention, it demands attention, and it signals strongly to us that it needs immediate attention and whatever gratifications it's capable of. But as adults, we are supposedly, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, told that we need to be able to defer certain kind of gratification. Even instinctive desires for gratification need to be deferred in order for us to become, as it were, reliable citizens. And this is exactly what Hobbes and Freud will take up later. And it's one of Freud's main points, that the only way we can live together in a community, the only way we can live together in a civilized kind of a society, would be for us to be able to suppress what we really want. We had not to act on what we really instinctively want. If we go around just trying to gratify ourselves 24/7, we're going to end up doing a lot of wrong things to each other. That's what Freud says, and that's also what Hobbes said even earlier. So all of that, Denise, is very interesting, and it leads to psychological questions, It leads to political questions, to all kinds of questions, some of which we will revisit. So I'm very glad you brought this up. And then Shidobe asked, but if good habits make us happy, want to be happy, why is it so hard for us to stick to the good habits? Well, I think the answer, or one answer to that, is because very often our instincts and our instinctual desire for gratification, it works against our own wisdom that we're better off practicing virtues and being more patient in achieving lasting happiness, as contrasted with instantaneous but very short-lived gratification, right? Because gratification doesn't last long, and it always wants us to want more gratification. And then very often you have this problem of diminishing return, and that is what made you happy yesterday. If it's a gratification kind of happiness, you need more of it the next day, and more of it the day after, and more of it the day after. You're never satisfied with the same amount. Whereas a virtue doesn't work this way. A virtue is something that you're always satisfied to practice. It's not something that makes you want more and more and more. So you could see the contrast between a virtue and, let's say, a gratifying kind of an experience. And Randy asks a very deeply philosophical question: how do we know what we really want? What a great question! And I'm going to stop right there. Aristotle would say, you know, you really want to be happy. Okay, Randy, let's start with Aristotle's answer. Aristotle's answer is, you know you want to be happy. Everybody knows that. But some people don't achieve it because they go about it the wrong way. In other words, they do not allow their souls to become engaged in activity in accordance with virtue. For one reason or another, they allow their souls to act in accordance with vice, which will lead to unhappiness and not happiness. Okay? So that's a good place to end the lecture. And a salad is good, but you'll turn it down for a burger. That's right, most people will, because we have an instinctive craving for fat, which in nature we never got enough of, protein and fat and all those things that a burger has. But we know in the long run, if we eat too many of them, you know, we end up probably obese or with coronary artery disease or some other nasty thing. So what we end up doing, if we acquire the habit, which Aristotle would say is a vice, of eating unhealthy food, in the long run, we pay a real price for it. So short-run gratification multiplied many times leads to long-term health problems. And so the virtuous way is obviously to eat more salad and less steak. Okay, that would be what we know now in light of contemporary science. All right, I'm going to leave it there. I'm glad to see you so engaged this morning. It makes me happy. This is a virtue too. And I hope you'll continue in your breakout groups to look specifically at Aristotle's main way of distinguishing. You may ask, how do we distinguish a virtue from a vice? If we want to be virtuous, how do we know, right? And he'll go on to answer that. And we'll look at that on Thursday, okay? So I wish you a very good day, a very good week. I'll see some of you Thursday. The rest of you will explore Aristotle's theory of virtue ethics and conclude it in your breakout groups. And take care, everyone. Have a wonderful week. And I'll look forward to seeing you again soon, okay?
Hi, Professor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good discussion this morning. I like your questions and your contributions. Keep it up and keep reading. Bye-bye for now.